Watch your language. During the break, somebody said, neoliberal. I want to make the case that neoliberal is a dumb word. When I say watch your language, let me be clear what I mean. I want to give an acknowledgement to Frank Luntz, who's one of the best, most notable language manipulators. He said war on terror. War on terror never has to end. It's not a war on a particular place. Tax relief assumes it's a burden. Starting to say Democrat Party instead of Democratic Party. Partial birth abortion instead of late-term abortion. Death tax. Climate change instead of climate catastrophe. We got to watch our language. Here's my challenge with neoliberal. I'll be giving some others today under the header of watch your language. My challenge with neoliberal, and to give it has been a term on the rise. I think maybe in part on the rise because of Russian bots. I think partly on the rise because of some misleading blogs. Partly on the rise because of a genuine, real concern. And why I think it's dumb, it is used to describe, is because it's misleading. There is another N-word that means miserly. It does not have racist roots, but I don't use that word because it can be confused with the most derided racial slur. Instead of neoliberal, I use market fundamentalist. The Peeler and Society, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, James Buchanan, influencing policymakers like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Alan Greenspan. The word neoliberalism started getting more purchase among Spanish-speaking scholars and then diffused into the English language study of political economy. The effort to get the left to bash the word neoliberal, to define Hayek as neoliberal, and then say anybody who is for Hayek stuff is neoliberal and then neoliberal is bad and so they are bad. I don't love it. And not because I want to say good things about Hayek or Milton Friedman or James Buchanan. But when people are asked in polls if they're liberal or conservative, I think we want the liberal number to be bigger rather than smaller. We might want, therefore, different words. We can lobby the pollsters. We don't want the word, though, that's supposed to mean the coalition other than conservatives to be a confusingly toxic word, any more than we'd want neo-progressive to mean racist and ethnocentric. I don't, in some respect, care that much about words, except for it's how we communicate and ultimately how we organize our brains. And therefore, when we want to criticize someone who we would define or how somebody, because here's the other part of why it's confusing, is that neoliberalism has also been used to define the ideology formed in the United States more in the 1970s. According to David Brooks, the prominent neoliberal politicians included Al Gore and Bill Clinton of the Democratic Party, included the people who weren't trying to eviscerate all taxes, all public services, all regulations, but were just sort of the center left. And therefore, you can get into a weird, tricky word game where you say, oh, Bill Clinton is the same thing as Hayek. Bill Clinton is not the same thing as Hayek. Yeah, they'd agree on some things that some of us might strongly disagree upon, but they are still vastly different, and vastly different from Milton Friedman. It is a confusing word. The godfather of that version of neoliberalism was the journalist Charles Peters, who in 1983 published a Neoliberals Manifesto. And by the way, the Neoliberals Manifesto was not the same thing as Hayek or Milton Friedman. It was not the same thing as Adam Smith. So for today's watch your language, market fundamentalist. The person who thinks that all we have to do is reward the powerful at the expense of the powerless and everything else will just work out. That the only kind of freedom that is needed is not freedom for human beings, is not freedom of thought, is not freedom of speech, but is freedom of purchased speech, of purchased thought, the freedom of capital to control, the freedom of money to do anything it wants to accrete, to consolidate, and to eviscerate any limitation that might in fact support human freedom. I don't know if that's neo. It's not that neo. John C. Calhoun was making the same argument 200 years ago. And it is one definition of liberal, but not the common definition of liberal that most people, that most human beings use. So I don't need to die on this hill. But I do think it's easier and a little more accurate, a little more helpful rhetorically to say market fundamentalist. Some other ones that I like, not accident but crash, not just climate change but climate fires and climate floods and climate catastrophe, not just a broad swath of free speech but differentiating purchase speech. Got that, by the way, from a Thom Hartmann caller about 3 years ago when I was listening to the Thom Hartmann show. I said, that's brilliant. When we're talking about purchase speech, let's say it's purchase speech. That's different than free speech. It wasn't free, it cost money. Another one is differentiating special interests to differentiate private interest and public interest. The oil lobbyist is different from the group of parents who are advocating to do something about gun violence, to do something about education. Those are vastly different things. Advocating for the consolidated self-interest is different than advocating for the broader public interest. Not just income inequality, but wealth inequality. Forgive me if this piece is being a little bit pedantic, but after reading Don't Think of an Elephant, and watching Frank Luntz and actually meeting the guy, and then tracking this stuff for 10 years, I keep this little list of how do we watch for Orwellian language, how do we watch for framed language. When somebody says death tax, no, no, no. No such thing as a death tax. All of us are taxed 100% at death. You can't take it with you. Estate tax, inheritance tax, rich kids tax, all accurate. Death tax, not accurate.